thank you very much, and I will take questions now as time permits.
To continue the thought that you were just going on, and I was asking myself, what are some of the implications of that kind of bundled technology on Earth? And immediately I began thinking of our conversation earlier about Egypt. And when our network's disrupted here, or do you see applications for things like that?
No question, no question. In fact, I'm dying to get a full-up bundle protocol on board the Android system. And there are two different reasons for that. One of them, of course, is that if you are capturing information and you can't transmit it, the reason the bundle protocol works at all is that it holds the data until a communication link is available, and then it transmits it. Whereas in the internet world, if there isn't any path to get to the destination, we throw the traffic away. That's because at the time those protocols were designed, memory was so expensive that you would never hold the information in the routers, the store and forward routers. So this is a very different philosophy. What that means, of course, is that you can deal with more disruption, and mobiles do get disrupted. I mean, no matter how hard we try, you know, you get into radio shadow, you go under bridges, you get into a variety of situations. So the answer is that you can make more robust certain kinds of communication. Now, it's clear if you can't transmit at all, that this voice conversation isn't going to work. And so there's nothing magic here. But if you were capturing information that you wanted to get out at some point, like a video or an audio recording or a picture or something like that, then this makes eminently good sense. And of course, the scientific application is very similar. We want very much to be able to capture the data and then get it to the receiving sites as soon as it's possible to do so. We've also tested this, as I mentioned earlier, in military tactical communications, and there is no question that the robustness is better than the standard TCP. Again, you don't get real time if there isn't any communication, but we got something like 3 to 5 times more data through the system with the bundle protocols, the delay and disruption tolerant networking protocols, than we could through TCP/IP, because it could hold on to the data until there was an opportunity to transmit instead of throwing it away. So the net result is yes, this could be a very powerful adjunct to existing mobile communications.
And do you have, is there any reason to believe that you were talking about all spacefaring nations could build into the same backbone much the way that they did with the internet? Do you have any reason to believe that that wouldn't be the case, that someone would, some sovereignty would choose not to play along and play nicely? And what would those, I mean, really taking the thought out, what would the implications for that be?
So if you were saying, would anyone decide not to play in the space case? Well, certainly somebody could say, I don't want to share any of my assets. It's my space vehicle and you can't touch it. I think that's an attitude that could be justified if you said, I want to have my entire space program be solely dependent on my own resources. We've already learned in the United States that we can't do that. For example, when the shuttle program is over, we have to rely on the Russian lift spacecraft until we can build our own again. So I've often thought that a lesson of the internet is not that information is power, but information sharing is power. And in this particular case, resource sharing is power, because we don't all have to pay for the same infrastructure. So I'm hoping that rational conclusions will be reached and everyone will adopt these protocols, but I can't guarantee that.
Fantastic. So I know that we have a long list of questions queued up on Twitter. So Samantha, could you share one with us?
I'd be glad to. The first question we have for you, Dr. Cerf, is how much was failure a part of the success in inventing the internet?
So let me make sure I've heard this is how much is failure a part of the success of the internet?
Correct.
So that's actually a really good point. Anytime you want to encourage people to be inventive, it's very helpful if you give them the freedom to fail. Now, if you fail all the time, that's not a particularly good outcome. But without the freedom to fail, you don't shoot high enough. And I can tell you, Larry Page, the Google CEO now, is passionate about that point, which is aim as high as you can. If you don't make it, you'll still get somewhere in there, and you'll probably get farther along if you aim high than you will if you aim low. So I think that's an extremely important point. and it's one that I benefited from. You learn a lot from making mistakes. At least you hope you do. I mean, if you don't learn anything from your mistakes, this is not a good outcome either.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so I'd like to encourage folks in the audience, if you have a question, just raise your hands. Now, I'd also like you to understand that the sound up here on the stage is not too good, so if you'll speak directly into the microphone,
Yeah, well,
it'll
that
help
may
us
still
to
not help.
hear
Look,
clearly.
I'm hearing impaired, and I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. So I may have to rely on my colleagues here to repeat a question if I didn't hear it. So
Okay.
have a shot.
So while we're thinking about that, I have one more. We've all heard stories about, well, these are not stories, I mean, it's fact about how spam traffic is slowing down the network. And it's just one example. And as I think about if everybody in this room were to add 100 devices that were communicating back to them with any regularity, you know, so my light bulbs, my refrigerator, my yogurt, you know, whatever, I mean, I can see a bazillion use cases and business opportunities in the Internet of Things. And so I can completely visualize it coming to pass. What's going to be the impact on, you know, ping rates?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, most of these kinds of device interactions are fairly brief. You know, current temperature, humidity, things of that sort don't take very many bits to describe, even if there are a large number of such devices. Also, the communication tends to be fairly confined. I mean, typically they all want to communicate with one thing, the controller, maybe one other thing, a recorder or something like that. So it's not quite as bad as broadcasting. It's certainly not as bad as putting video out to, you know, 100 million people all at the same time. So the bigger impact right now is on the higher bandwidth kinds of applications, and device control I don't think is particularly challenging in that regard. I did want to mention one thing, though, for your consideration. One thing that we have not done at all well in the Internet is to use broadcast capability in the way that it is most efficient. So we have satellites that are in orbit. They have the ability to transmit down to 100 million receivers, but the Internet protocols tend to turn those things into point-to-point links. That's what we turn Ethernet into a point-to-point link. We build Ether switches instead of broadcasting. And I think that these satellite communications folks who normally will sell you point-to-point links might have a whole new business opportunity if they would allow us to transmit packets, raining them down on 100 million different receivers. We could encrypt them so that not everybody who gets them can necessarily read them if we're trying to constrain who gets access to the information. But it's very efficient to send a large amount of information through broadcast means. And the same can be true of ground-based radio. When you're transmitting something and you're trying to hop through a radio network, sometimes the path that you thought was the right one isn't going to work because that next hop is blocked for some reason. If your packet can be heard by more than one forwarding agent, you could imagine some of them saying, I didn't hear an ack back from the guy that was supposed to get it, but I could get further along, I'll transmit it for you. This is what we did with the packet radio net in 1976. These are ways of taking advantage of the fact that a radio can be heard by more than one receiver at a time, and I would love to see some serious protocol work making multicast and broadcast literally a first-class part of the Internet's architecture, which it is not today.
So, for instance, you could update everyone's software, or you could fix a patch or something like that.
Yeah. So it could be anything that you can digitize. So it doesn't have to be just video and audio. As you point out, it could be software. It could be books. It could be a variety of things.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to your vision, and I was thinking, do you see us wearing like wireless wearable sensors that then can interoperate with those other sensors? Like if you're watching TV and my skin galvanic response senses arousal, then maybe that will prompt the TV to show me that ad of the Apple computer. So do you see us also wearing these sensors that can sense how we are feeling and what our needs are, and that interact with the Internet of Things itself?
So I had a fair amount of trouble hearing all of that. It's not your fault, it's me.
She was asking about, you know, what are some of the opportunities from sensors communicating. She used the example
Right,
of,
okay, yes.
of a skin-based sensor
Yes.
that noted her response to
Yes,
something
yes.
she's watching on
Okay, actually,
television.
I remember that you're very interested in the psychology of all these things. Neuroscience is uncovering a variety of things about the way we actually think and react. So yes, that sounds like a new Nielsen product, right? Which is the sensor. You volunteer to be sensed to figure out how you're really reacting to this. It's hard to lie about your physiological reactions to things. There are probably some more positive. I don't mean to suggest that that's not positive, but there might be some other constructive ways of taking advantage of this. Your mobile already has accelerometers in it, so it can tell if you're moving. It can tell something about its orientation. There may be a number of things that you could do to help detect problems in the human condition. Suppose that you haven't moved for the last 24 hours or something. Somebody might become worried because they haven't heard from you either. You could use these same devices. Are beginning to have sensors on them to detect biohazards or to detect other kinds of chemical risk factors. One very interesting idea that Deborah Estrin at UCLA has been pursuing is a kind of crowdsourcing of information about hazardous conditions. The mobiles are capable of reporting things either automatically, or you just take it out and take a picture of some place that's producing some sort of pollution, and then you transmit that data in. You have a date and a time, location, and here's the image that caused you to worry. This ability to collect information and then analyze it could tell us a lot about local conditions that could be inimical to human civilization. So I really like your idea of extending the utility of these internet-enabled devices.
It occurs to me, as I listen to that, I remember conversations that were taking place a few years ago around the notion of smart dust, which were sensors that literally could be dropped from a plane over an area and begin communicating with themselves. But they weren't really thought of at that time as devices that would communicate necessarily back to the internet in general. But I could imagine if you really needed to get information about what was actually happening on the ground, say in Joplin, Missouri, just recently, what do you see as some of the applications for civil preparedness and just that whole notion of things being able to communicate back in real time?
Well, it's pretty clear that we as a society have taken advantage of some of that already. In the UK, there are lots of webcams.
There sure are.
And apparently, you are on TV quite a bit during the course of the day. Now, we can now argue about how far can you go, what about privacy, where is the limit? But I have to say that, first of all, I think that there is a considerable opportunity there to use these kinds of technologies in order to improve our ability to communicate under conditions that otherwise would not work well. Having the ability to store and forward through a network, in the case like the one I have in my house, is a very, very resilient way of getting data. So I think that there are some very constructive things that can be done. But at the same time, I worry about whether we have any privacy left at all. I have one small anecdote that reinforced for me the side effect of people carrying around mobiles that have cameras, video recorders, the ability to transmit data and everything else back into the internet. I had to go to an event in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the only way to get from the airport to downtown was on this big long road, which didn't have any alternatives. And the security people said, we don't want you to drive on that road because if anything happens, we can't get off because there's no alternative paths. So they insisted on a helicopter. Well, that was okay with me because it was 2 hours by car and 12.5 minutes by helicopter, so that was all right with me. So we took the helicopter and I landed, and I went into the hotel to register, and about 20 minutes later, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, you're on YouTube. And I said, what do you mean I'm on YouTube? And he said, well, go look, and he gave me the little URL. So I looked, and someone had been on the lawn of the hotel where the helicopter was landing, and he saw the helicopter coming in, so he got out his mobile, and he takes a video of the helicopter coming down, And then you hear him, in the audio saying, as I'm getting out, he says, "That's Vint Cerf." And so he put it up on YouTube. Says, this is how Vint Cerf travels. And all I can say is it's a good thing it wasn't a black helicopter. But the fact that it got up on YouTube in 20 minutes after I had landed really surprised me. I suppose it shouldn't have, but it did. And it tells me that anonymity and privacy are very hard to come by these days.
Well, and I think it also speaks to, we have some very definite choices to be made about where we spend our efforts. And so, with Facebook now getting the facial recognition software that, was really pioneered by the UK, that many of us academics have been wanting for years to help us, categorize movies and that kind of thing. And so instead it's being used in this way that's not necessarily in the public's best interest, things that actually could advance our knowledge. So I think as we go, you can see the Internet of Things, some commercial uses that wouldn't necessarily be the best thing for the human.
So this is a very good example of the two-edged sword problem. Every time you create infrastructures like this, it's possible to use it constructively, and it's also possible to abuse it. In the case of facial recognition, the obvious scenario that could be awkward is that someone has taken a photograph of the Eiffel Tower, and they put it up on their Facebook. And there were people in the image, too, because they couldn't avoid that. And someone else sees this picture because it was publicly available and recognizes a person who's in front of the Eiffel Tower and tags that person. And then someone else is looking around for pictures of that person, discovers it, and there's a date and a time. And the next thing that happens is there's an email saying to Joe, you told me that you were in Rome on this date, but I see a picture of you that's labeled date time in front of the Eiffel Tower. What's going on? And then you get into the more complicated variation of that, where the date and time have been falsified, or any of a variety of scurrilous things, to say nothing of Photoshop showing up and putting you in a place where you weren't, and then your facial recognition gets. This is a mess. So I think that those of us who care about our quality of life in this increasingly networked environment really have to think about what sorts of social guidelines we'd like to adopt in order to protect ourselves from some of these abuses. We do this in other domains. For example, we notice that some people drink and some people drive and some people do both. And we say, well, we don't think that's a good idea. But we know we can't stop it. But we can say, as a society, in this society, we consider drinking and driving to be harmful, and we won't, we don't allow it. However, we can't stop it. But if we catch you, there will be consequences. And there may be many of these sorts of potential abuses that will have to be treated in the same way. We can't stop them, but we can tell people that if they're caught doing something that we consider socially abusive, that there will be consequences.
Okay. So, Samantha, do you...
Yes, Dr. Cerf, how will this future internet you described in your presentation enable ways to engage students in the classroom, specifically in experiential learning?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
The things you discussed in your comments, how can those apply to the classroom, and especially in experiential ways?
Right, okay, thank you. That's a lovely question. So one thing that I am now completely persuaded of is that we should expunge the word teach from our vocabulary and focus on learn. And second, that we learn best by doing things, not by being told how to do them, not by being told about them, but by being helped to do them. And when we make mistakes and we come up with the wrong result, the thing we want more than anything is to learn how to get the right result. What was wrong with my brain model that caused me to get the wrong answer? So I see these technologies as potential opportunities to help people do things, possibly in a virtual environment, that they could not easily have done in the real environment. So you might think about dry chemistry kinds of experiments, or biotechnology kinds of things, computational biology, where you are simulating what is understood about the way cells work or the way brain function works. We don't know everything, but you could imagine beginning to try ideas out and learning how the results come out. I think that between that and the possibility of helping people collaborate together in their work as they learn, that we have a very powerful engine here. And the collaboration doesn't necessarily have to be strictly local, because the network goes everywhere, not counting the fact that there are still time zones and we haven't gotten rid of those. We may be able to collaborate over longer distances. Google certainly sees a great deal of power in the ability of people to interact with each other with Google Documents, whether it's a spreadsheet or a document, Word document, text document of some sort. So this ability to collaborate can enhance people's ability to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So do we have questions from the audience?
This might already be possible, but I'm just wondering, is there, when talking about networking...
I'm sorry, could I stop you for a second? This having to repeat is a pain in the neck. So what I'm going to do is hop down here where I can lip read you if I have to, and that makes it faster. Okay? There, all right, fire away.
All right. Well, I'll use the mic anyway.
No, that's so everybody else can hear too.
Well, and this might be possible already happening, but is there any way, I mean, when talking about networking technologies, it's usually the transmission of information from one location to another, both being powered by some form of energy. But is there any way that you can suspend that information in between devices, so that that information can be accessed either through passing through it or using other devices as you move through it? Is that something that's possible?
Well, okay, so you're actually asking a question which has some pretty interesting potential side effects. In a sense, the delay and disruption tolerant networking that I talked about for the interplanetary system does that, because the network stores data until there's an opportunity to transmit it. That's not quite what you had in mind. Here's the image I have of what you have in mind. Let's imagine that I'm transmitting data optically, just for the sake of argument. You sort of want, what you said brought this picture to mind. The data is being transmitted, and I capture this optical wavefront somehow, and it's frozen, and other people can pluck it at will, which sounds pretty weird. There is two things that have been done. First of all, I don't know if you've ever read any of the experiments about taking a light wave, going through a particular nanomaterial, and literally stopping that light wave propagation in the nanomaterial. And then by changing local conditions, it propagates back out again. That's a physical way of holding onto the information. In some sense, it's different from storing the data in a memory of some sort, of a classical memory like the delay and disruption tolerant net, but it's still a physical way of trapping the information. I thought you might be going to a slightly other place, which has to do with quantum entanglement. Now, this is a completely different thing where the data takes no time at all to move from the source to the destination. Now, all of you understand that it violates the current laws of physics. But the notion of entanglement has the interesting property that you can take two things for some value of thing. It might be two photons, or maybe even multiple things. Today they've been able to put into an entangled state more than one object. Let's just take two photons. They get entangled. And now we take the two photons that have become entangled, and we take one of them and we transport it to Mars, physically. And we have these two entangled particles. The theory is that if you examine the state of the particle, the photon, the state on Earth, as soon as you figure out which state its spin is in, you instantly know what the state of the other one is because they're entangled. However, you didn't communicate. And the reason you didn't communicate is that you couldn't force the state of the photon on Earth to be what you want it to be. Now, if we could figure out a way to force that state, then we might actually be able to communicate instantaneously. Now, this would be very attractive. You'd still have to get the entangled thing to the place where you want it to go before you could take advantage of this effect. But I keep thinking for an interstellar mission, this would be very helpful because we could send a whole bunch of entangled photons to Alpha Centauri. Now, it might take 65,000 years to get there with the current propulsion systems available. But if we could get up to maybe 20% the speed of light, we could get the darn photons to the right place. And then we could signal back literally at 0 time because of the ability to do quantum communication, except for the fact that nobody's demonstrated that capability yet, so we don't know if it's possible. All right, sorry.
Now that is really the future of the internet. Now we are just about at the end of our time. We have time for one more question. So is there a burning question in the room? Or should we go to
we got another
Twitter?
one. Oh, you got one down there. Okay, well, I'll follow the microphone here. This is part of my health plan, which is running around like Geraldo.
Giving the camera folks some...
Wait, don't start till I get there.
I won't, don't worry. You're getting walking in at least.
There we are, okay.
I wanted to ask what you think is the greatest threat to the public internet versus the private internet, and what we can do most effectively to work against that, given the fact that the vast majority of the population doesn't really understand issues such as net neutrality. It's not on their radar, and it's very hard to move legislators who are instead moved by AT&T visiting them in the middle of the night.
Well,
And
or
so,
even they may just be moved by the simple, a campaign contribution.
Right, and of course the legislators don't necessarily understand the complexities of the issues in this area either.
That's also true.
I'd
So,
like to hear your thoughts on that a little bit.
okay, so you've asked a very meaty question. The first thing I would observe, I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak to you from my backside, as it were. Let me go back over this way. I don't know, the old fart is still farting. Okay, so first of all, the threat that you mentioned is a kind of political one and a legislative one, and but there are broader threats than that, but let me first focus on this part of the question. I have often wished that I could say to legislators, dear legislator, please don't pass any laws about the internet until you have some idea about how it works.
Right.
And,
Amen. Amen.
And I don't totally despair of being able to achieve the objective, but those of you who are involved in the new media, you might consider helping me do a congressional comic book that describes how the internet works.
Graphic novel.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like it's an insult, but it is not. Comics are an incredibly terse way of communicating information. They are extremely powerful if they're done well. And so I mean that in a very sincere way, that a simple explanation and well-illustrated comic book about the internet may be exactly the right thing. I mean, having a comic book model in your head about the internet which has sufficient fidelity that when you reason about the internet with that little comic book model, it will lead you to the right conclusions, that's really powerful. So I actually think it would be a good thing. Now, the broader problem that we face is not just that legislation inhibits competition and the provision of choice to users. The net is, in fact, a vulnerable thing. Now, there are lots of reasons why, and some of it is that the work that I did with other colleagues in the early 1970s on a fully secured version was classified because we used capabilities from the National Security Agency that couldn't be released to anybody. So we had this, I was schizoid. I had a very secured architecture, but I couldn't tell any of my friends about it who didn't have clearances. And so the public internet grew up in a different dimension. It turns out, of course, today we have publicly available technology which is quite powerful and would allow us to build a more resistant, resilient, and safer network, and that's what's happening. That's why DNSSEC is important. That's why the RPKI is important. That's why end-to-end crypto is important, HTTPS and so on. However, we do have the problem that we have vulnerable operating systems and we have vulnerable browsers, and the most significant infections today come from going to a website, downloading the home page. Remember, it's just a file, it's HTML or XML, and then interpreting that home page with the browser. In the early days of the net, the home page file just had imagery and text and some formatting information, it was pretty innocuous. Today, of course, it has Java and JavaScript and Python and other executables. And the browser, if it's not paranoid about this, will download and execute whatever it sees. Some of what may be executed stores information in an operating system, creating a zombie, which has now become part of a botnet. So we need to make more paranoid browsers, browsers that will resist executing things that they shouldn't. We want to give them the least possible privilege within the operating system they're running in. We want the operating systems to be more resilient and more able to resist having information stored where it doesn't belong. There's even currently a very interesting proposition that's being pursued. It came out of discussions with the National Security Agency. When your computer first boots up, there's a little microcode program that's called a BIOS, sort of the basic I/O capability. It boots in, it reads in the operating system. There can't be a more vulnerable moment in the story of a personal computer than the moment when it's booting in the operating system. So what NSA proposed and the chip makers are pursuing is that that little piece of microcode is digitally signed. And the hardware will refuse to execute the BIOS if it can't validate the digital signature. If you're going to update the BIOS, the thing that's being updated had better have a valid digital signature or it ain't going to happen. So this is not perfect. Somebody who is able to generate a successful digital signature and somehow sneak it in as valid could still kind of interfere with the system. But this would put a significant barrier in the way of the most vulnerable attacks against the operating systems. Typically, these USB thumb drives and so on had been used to infect operating systems that way. This is sometimes called the drive-by download, where you go by and poof, you're infected. There are a lot of things along those lines, better operating systems, better browsers, better hardware, or cooperating hardware and software, cooperating to use, to reinforce security. And finally, just one other thing. At Google, you know that we've publicized pretty broadly the attacks that we encountered twice now, whose origins appear to be in China. We took several actions, especially after the earlier of the two attacks, to protect ourselves. We now carry around, either as a small USB device or as a piece of software in a mobile, what's called two-factor authentication capability. So I can't get into the Google network without supplying not only a username and a password, but also a cryptographically generated 6-digit number. And that either is generated by a little USB device or is generated in my mobile. And that inhibits people from pretending to be me, because even if they figure out what my password is, they don't have the device that generates the random 6-digit number. That number changes every 30 seconds or whatever. It's at some frequent interval. I'm not sure it's 30, but it's something along those lines. So that capability goes a long ways towards preventing people from hijacking your accounts just because they could figure out what the password was. Or worse, have you had the experience where you go to a site, you can't remember your password, and it says, click here if you can't remember the password, and they ask you a secret question, like, what's your mother's maiden name? Unfortunately, a lot of those questions turn out to be, the answers to those questions are discoverable on the internet by Googling around. And the consequence of that is that you didn't get very much security from it. So instead of all those sorts of things, having this two-factor authentication is a very strong tool. And we make that available to the general public at Google if you wish to use it. So I think there are a number of steps that need to be taken. But I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to educate people, not just the legislators, but the rest of us, about why some practices, as convenient as they may seem, are also very dangerous and need to be altered with a different set of tactics. We need to enable people to do that. Okay.
All right.
I guess
so
that's all the
with
time
that, I think we're at the end of our time. The newest NMC fellow. Thank you so very, 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 very much.
There you go.
Pleasure.
Thank you.